I would just wanted to indicate some aspects that could be are related to utility of open science in the reviewing process. Why basically OSF? I think that those of you who are not aware where it was founded and why, it was basically founded because in psychology we had this, and still have to some extent, this replication crisis. So basically authors and also the father of the OSF, Brian Nosek, he basically he noticed that it's pretty hard to replicate effects in psychology. And one of the reasons why it's hard, because on one hand we have a strong publication bias, because editors, journals prefer articles that present significant results, but also it's because a lot of papers, they are based on low sample sizes. They use methods that represent rather low validity. So as a consequence of this replication crisis, there was a call for transparency, reproducibility, and of course, all of that was aimed at reducing questionable research practices. So they started to build OSF. And as you could see, based on Anita's presentation, OSF offers tons of interesting tools for pre-registration and also for other stuff. And it also promotes something that it's called registered reports. So it's to some extent something more advanced than pre-registration. It's a process where basically you submit your proposal to a journal, and then the whole process starts before the data is even collected. So reviewers and also Action Editor helps you to some extent to come up with an excellent project, and then data is collected, and after data is collected, an author submits a final report. So since still OSF is a pretty new project, from time to time you probably can hear and read some papers presenting the effectiveness or consequences of using OSF, in this case, for instance, registered reports. So I just want to show you some data. So as you can see in the lower right corner, we have effects that can be found in traditional literature. So it's a literature that basically does not utilize pre-registrations, does not utilize registered reports. And here the main indicator of the effects of introducing the open science is representation of null findings. So basically they show that if we focus only on the traditional literature, then null findings are published is rather very low. So you can see that it's around 10%. If you also take into account the confidence intervals, you would see that it can be even lower than 10%, which is basically striking, because how it's even possible that in empirical studies, this is psychology, you can find so little null effects. It's just statistically not possible. However, since more and more papers were published based on the idea of open science, pre-registration, replication, and also register report, this tendency was reversed. So as you can see, if you take into account all pre-registered reports, pre-registered studies, this changes, and the percentage is around 60. And again, if you take into account confidence intervals, it's still way higher than for the traditional literature. So there are some, I would say, some benefits of this kind of situation, because we are more aware what actually works. So, and that to some extent influences how we accumulate knowledge, what we also tell to our students, how we formulate hypotheses for future research. All of that we'll see probably will have strong consequences of how we function in the academia and what actually is happening. And then one or two slides that will focus on reviewing and why I find OSF pretty useful at different stages and depending on your role. How I see the reviewing process. It's also quite important to explain this point of view, because everyone, I would say almost everyone, would would come up with something different ideas regarding why we actually review and what this reviewing process is about. I find that the reviewing process is mainly about helping colleagues. So because my interest as a psychologist that is focused on self-regulation research is to make sure that we publish only good studies that are based on gold quality practices. It's also to some extent gatekeeping, but only in terms of focusing on scientific soundness and rigor. So I would say that when I review papers, for instance, I do not pay attention whether results are significant or not. To me, it's more important whether a specific paper is scientifically sound or there was enough rigor in terms of conducting the study, validating the data, and also analyzing it. And lastly, to me, it's very important that authors are clear. So there is a clarity, consistency, how things are calculated, reported, and what is disclosed. And also it's all about transparency. It's also important to me as a reviewer, but of course as an editor, to actually know what authors were doing with the data, how they define their analysis. So going through those three roles. As an author, I heavily appreciate the fact that OSF includes tons of different templates, experiments, cross-sectional studies, but also more advanced projects like meta-analysis. What makes also to some extent education easier because I can always tell the students, for instance, use this template, it explains how you should prepare your studies and so on. So if I, for instance, teach advanced courses on meta-analysis, I always recommend that to students. They can basically see what they actually need before they start to do a meta-analysis. So that's super helpful. Another thing that I heavily appreciate in OSF and how it's actually used is that I can share my code, and also I can see code for analysis that other authors share. So for instance, if I struggle with doing analysis, with defining a model, then I can just take a look what other people did and resolve my issues. So it just basically saves time. Another benefit of using OSF, since people know it's open and you can share materials and OSF displays that nicely, is when, for instance, I conduct research that are related to controversial topics. Like, for instance, I do study potential consequences of video games, and it's super controversial topic in psychology because there are like two groups of people. Some think that video games, specifically the violent games, they do not have bad effects, but the other group that shows that there can be some negative effects. So basically, if we want to contribute to this kind of field, OSF is just something that can be used for sharing the code and showing how we did our research and why and how we found, for instance, negative effects related to video games. So it's specifically important for this kind of topics, I would say. As a reviewer, I heavily appreciate, of course, if authors, they share not only the materials, but also the code for analysis, also data, because then I can understand the project better, I can see analysis better, and also I can improve my recommendation as it could be done if the code or data wouldn't have been shared. So that's beneficial for reviewer. For instance, if I have a lot of time for this kind of review, I always dig into the code because I find it important. This contribution develops, of course, the whole field. So I think it's worthy. And lastly, as an editor, I basically try to take into account always the quality of the manuscript, soundness, and rigor. I do not pay attention too much on whether results that are presented are significant or not. So that's not my major focus. And if authors are sharing the code, sharing the data, to me, to some extent, it's easier to influence the field and select those manuscripts that basically are following rules regarding being open, transparency, but of course, scientific soundness and rigor. And also at the end, I would say that everyone can benefit from it if we use OSF, sharing code, data, and whatever, because to a great extent that can improve our accumulation of knowledge. Because if we know that there are many null effects, all of that should be widely shared and disclosed to everyone. And another thing that can be also useful, we can use OSF in this way that we can do some kind of post-publication reviews, because if data, manuscripts, and code are shared, then everyone can basically see what was going on and then provide opinion after the manuscript is published. If not OSF or not any other platform, it can be pretty hard because post-reviewing is just looking into the manuscript itself. And then it's pretty hard to evaluate. But if the information is provided through open platforms, then the publication, post-publication reviewing is way easier. Yeah, and that's my experience. I wonder what do you think about that? Maybe you want to share something else, your experiences. I'm open to a nice conversation. Thank you a lot.